The classroom is officially yours. Gavriel Porton, thank you for joining us today. The classroom is yours.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Lukowski. I was listening to that introduction and I was thinking, wow, I'm like interviewing for a job. I hope not. Okay, that appears somewhere on one of my CVs. I would say of all those things which Rabbi Greg listed, probably the most important thing, or the most central thing out of that is being a Yerushalmi, as they say here in Yerushalayim, being a Jerusalemite. My parents grew up in Philadelphia. They were born and raised in Philadelphia. My father
Shout out to Philadelphia.
Shout out to Philadelphia, absolutely. We spent lots of time in Philadelphia, sabbatical years. That's a whole other story. Phillies, Eagles. My father, when he was in college, doing his master's, he saw a J&F movie way back when. This was in the early 50s, and saw pictures of the newborn state and was simply inspired. And he said, wow, the future of the Jewish people is in the land of Israel. That's where I need to be. I need to finally.
Gavriel, I'm just gonna, sorry to interrupt. I think your, Gavriel, I think your internet is not, the Wi-Fi or wherever you are is not so stable. Are you able to sort of reconnect? Am I the only one having?
Wait a second, give me a moment. I'll move. Got to move to another room, but give me a moment. Internet is a function of where you are. So 1 second. 1 moment. There we go. That's the advantage of this.
Although you're still in front of the coat, and the modern technology still being in front of the coattail.
I was just gonna say. Okay. There it is. Okay, this should be the better Wi-Fi and more stable, closer to the router, and from past experience of classes, this should be more stable. Okay.
Awesome. Thanks, Gavriel. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem. So coming back to the story, my parents spent a year in Haifa. My father got a post as a junior lecturer in Haifa. Just so you should appreciate what it means to make Aliyah. My father had lined up a professorship at UCLA right before he left, and he gave it up for a junior lecturer in Haifa. That was quite a sacrifice. I'm indebted to this day. We all are, the family. And a year after at the end of the year in Haifa, my father turned to my mother and said, well, maybe we should go back to America because Haifa is not quite what I imagined. The University of Haifa is not like my dream. And my mother said to him, she gave him two answers. She said, number one, we're not going back to the United States. We're here. This is where I'm raising my children. And number two, my mother said to him, not only are we not going back to the United States, but we're moving to Yerushalayim. And my father had no job in Yerushalayim. And he looked at her and he said, what do you mean? And my mother said, that's what we're doing. And that's what they did. So they moved to Yerushalayim. My father commuted for a number of years till he finally got a post at Hebrew U. That's how I ended up a Yerushalmi. And that's what I want to talk to you about this evening. Number of reasons. One, this is where I live. This is my passion. Two, this week on Friday is a very special day in the Jewish calendar, Yom Yerushalayim, where we celebrate the reunification of Yerushalayim in the Six-Day War. An interesting day. On the one hand, celebrated by a certain segment of Israeli society, mostly religious. On the other hand, a bit of a forgotten day, both here in Israel and in many places in the diaspora. But nonetheless, a very significant day, and that was a very momentous moment 52 years ago. So without further ado, I want to dive in. I'm going to share a PowerPoint and just show me some thumbs that that you actually can see the PowerPoint and that it's working and that we're good technology. Okay, excellent.
You got it, Gabriel. It's good.
Thank you. Okay, so here's how I want to start the story of Yerushalayim. This is a really cool picture. It was published in a National Geographic documentary that came out, I don't know, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And this is a picture which they put as the beginning of that documentary. It's a picture of the world. It's a picture of Earth. But the focus of Earth is one spot specifically. And if you look carefully, you'll recognize that that's the Temple Mount. Right in the middle, right over here, is Dome of the Rock, Temple Mount, and all around it, the Old City. Right? And this is National Geographic, right? This is not some Jewish organization. This is not AIPAC. This is not the Likud. This is not some kind of, right? This is National Geographic. And that's how they decided to portray Jerusalem in relation to the world, right? And it's a very interesting portrayal. It actually has ancient roots. And I want to read to you a short midrash that the rabbis that we find in Midrash Haggadah from about 1,500 years ago. Derech Eretz Zuta is the name of the midrash. It's one of the tractates that appears kind of at the end of the Talmud. And here's the midrash. Here's the quote. All right, and 1,500 years ago versus National Geographic today. Abba Isi, son of Yochanan, said in the name of Samuel the Little, Shmuel HaKatan. Interesting name for a rabbi, Shmuel HaKatan, but that's another discussion. This world resembles the eyeball of a man. Right. So if you take the earth, say the rabbis, it's like somebody's eye. The white of the eye is the ocean that surrounds the whole land. The black of the eye is the world, the continents. The circle in the black is Jerusalem, Yerushalayim. And the image or the pupil in the circle is the temple, which will be rebuilt in the near future. Amen. Right? That's how the midrash ends, right? This was 1,500 years ago. They were optimistic, right? Near future, it's been 1,500 years. That hasn't happened yet. But it's an interesting choice of images, right? Of an image that this midrash chooses to display the world in Yerushalayim. The world is an eye, and in the center of the eye is Yerushalayim. And I think, right, when you think about this image, rabbis are looking at it in two different ways. If you want to, right, what's the eye? The eye is how we see the world, how we understand it. Right? That's our main sense, right, with which we take things in and understand the world. And I think the rabbis are saying, amongst other things, if you want to understand the world, come to Yerushalayim. And not just the Jewish world. Right? If you want to understand the world life, come to the city of Yerushalayim. Lots of things you can talk about when it comes to Yerushalayim. I want to take you back close to 3,000 years through archaeology and through a biblical story to one of the most dramatic and I think exciting and powerful and insightful chapters of the city of Yerushalayim. So here we go. Here's Yerushalayim today. And this is a picture taken from the south looking at the old city of Yerushalayim. Here are the walls of the old city. In the background, Mount Scopus. And if you take a look here, right, you see the golden dome, the Dome of the Rock, which is a clear landmark. Right? Basically, we're looking at the Temple Mount from the south. All right, what National Geographic looked at from the top, here we're looking from the south. We're going to focus on not the old city, right, as we call it today, but the area to the south of the old city and outside of it. Right? Here circled in the blue. It's a small area. It's barely, right, 10 acres, 40 dunam. This is the area of the actual ancient city of Jerusalem, the ancient city of Jerusalem, what we call also the city of David. Right? It's a tiny city. In fact, to walk from one end to the other, from left to right or from west to east, takes you maximum 7-8 minutes. And to walk north-south from the top all the way down is maybe 15 minutes. Right? It's a very small city. And the question, right, that I ask my students and I ask visitors who I take to the city of Jerusalem, if it's so small and you find no great monuments in this city, what is it about the city of Jerusalem that made it such a meaningful, powerful, inspirational, eternal city? So this is a picture of today. What did it look like 3,000 years ago when King David conquered the city? So this is an artist's rendition, right, based on archaeological digs. So this wall, right, which the artist has surrounding the entire city, parts of it were actually unearthed in the 1960s by an architect, a British architect, Kathleen Kenyon, around this area. These fortifications surrounding the spring of the city were unearthed about 10 years ago by Israeli archaeologists. All right? And we have here this city on a hill with fields all around it. So it has everything that you need for, all right, an ancient city. You have the food source in the fields around. You have the water spring. You have your natural defense on the hill. And it even sits not far from, right, the major highways that take you across the country. Inside the city, you'll see two more buildings. One here, this is the palace, which would have been the king's palace, perhaps King David or Solomon, depending on the archaeologists who you ask. That's a whole nother story. We're not going to touch on that now, but this area was excavated, right, by Lat Mazar about 15 years ago. She claims King David. Archaeologists who agree, those who dispute. And further up at the top of the city is the Beit HaMikdash, the temple which Solomon, Shlomo, the son of David, would build. Before we move on, one interesting thing about this picture is the derug, the leveling of the city. This is the bottom, this is the top, the people. Above the people, the top of the city, the king. And above the king, and this is a critical point in the city of Jerusalem, and this is the beginning of the key to why the city was so, why its message was so important and eternal. Above the king is God. The king is only a servant and only an instrument, right, to bring God's message, way of life, justice, etc., to the city. Okay. Interestingly enough, the city of David, which was the original city of Jerusalem, right, and such a momentous city in which we have scores and scores of story of in the Tanakh, for the last 1,500 years, up until the beginning of the 20th century, was pretty much forgotten. The focus of the city had moved north to where the old city is today, and that area of the city of David essentially became buried under rubble for over 1,500 years, from the end of the Byzantine period up until the 20th century. 20th century comes around, and the European powers, England, France, Germany, I should say maybe Western powers, also America, started taking an interest in the Middle East. Strategic, economic, political, and also historical, religious. And we'll find archaeologists, Western archaeologists, starting to dig in this area. And here's a picture from the 1920s, 1924-25, of a British archaeologist. There was a pair of them. This is one of them. I don't remember which one this one is. McAllister and Duncan, two British archaeologists, and they came from the PEF, Palestine Exploration Fund, which was an interesting organization in London. It was a kind of hachla'a, sort of kilaim, a mix of historical, archaeological, scientific study together with a little espionage and political assistance to the British Empire. But here they are in the city of David, and they uncovered this large wall, this sloping wall. And he's, you can see him standing on top of it. And when they uncovered it, they didn't uncover anything below or above it. One of the things they asked themselves is, what is this wall? They had all kinds of theories and suggestions. One of them was a very interesting one, and actually turned out to be true, was that this wall was a supporting wall for a large structure on top. And that's a structure which Elam Mazar would excavate, the palace of the kings. 1970s, 1980s, an Israeli archaeologist by the name of Yigal Shiloh, very well-known Israeli archaeologist, will extend the dig to the sides, and down to the bottom. And he will find that this wall, which was built some 3,000 years ago, a couple centuries later was dug into and built, they built all kinds of structures, private houses and rooms in this area. So it served as a secondary structure. Now, when you look at it, and here I'll show you, this is what it looks like when you sit across from it. I often ask my students, I say, what do you see? And they look at me as if like, duh, rocks, stone. And I'm like, okay, do you see anything in those rocks? They're like, well, pillar or wall. And I'm like, aren't you excited? And they look at me, no. And you're right, when you look at these walls, nothing very exciting about it. And I say, well, if you were an archaeologist, you'd be jumping for joy, And archaeologists are excited because they see pillars here, and the pillars support a roof, and this was a house, and next to it they found a little stone, which was a toilet, all kinds of, But aside from the stones, the archaeologists also found other artifacts inside this area. They would find all these jars and vases, to store wine, oil, food, cooking pots, And suddenly these walls become not just ancient walls, but they become people's homes. And you can start imagining a Shabbat meal, a Passover, Seder, all kinds of things which took place in these houses. They found statuettes, idols, Canaanite, Philistine idols. You're like, what? In Jerusalem, the city of David, 5 minutes walk from the Beit HaMikdash, the temple? And then you scratch your head for a moment and you say, oh, yeah, that's what the prophets are talking about all the time, that the people are worshiping God and they're worshiping idols. Here it is. Suddenly the biblical story is coming alive. But I want to focus on two more finds, which I think are the most exciting finds in this area, which the archaeologists would call, by the way, Shetach G, Area G, A very original name. They had different areas they excavated. This was Area G. The purple one here on the left and the yellow one here on the right at the bottom of this sloping wall inside the walls. So let's go first to the purple one. Here's that purple spot, in an artist's rendition of what was there in the time of King David and King Solomon. That sloping wall supporting the palace on top. So keep in mind, this spot, where we're going to see in a moment, what they found was right below the royal palace, or right below what you would call today, the Washington Mall, Capitol Hill. We're in the center of power and politics in Jerusalem. Here's a picture, of this spot. On the left-hand side is how you see it today in the City of David National Park. Those of you who have been there, you walk down these steep stairs, and there's the sloping wall over here to the right and down below. And on the right is a picture of one of the archaeologists who dug with Yigal Shiloh, and that little space where they found the finds. What did they find? Here we go. They found a pile of about 60 of these little clay pieces They're about yay big. They're about, like I would say, the size of a thumbnail, right? They're really small. They're made out of clay. All of these 60-some boule were charred in a fire. So they were hardened in a fire. And if you look carefully at them, you'll see that they have in the middle a line, most of them, a double line, right? Here's a line, here's a line. And some of them also have a groove, right? Line and a groove. Now, above and below these lines, they discover, the archaeologists, that there's Hebrew writing. And each one of these little boule had on it a name. Somebody, Chaim ben Yaakov, right? Ariel ben, right? Michael, right? Making up names. And because they're archaeologists and they're curious, they started reading the names. First name, second, 20, 30, 40, 50. Suddenly, one of the archaeologists screams, "Whoa, I got it!" And they're like, "What'd you see? What'd you see?" And he said, I saw before, okay, I skipped. Here is what you would, right, use this boule for, right? To seal a letter, right? An official document. The archaeologist says, "Look at this seal." And they're like, "Yeah." Like, "Don't you see it?" And they're like, "Yeah, what do you see?" It says, "Legmariyahu ben Shaphan." Like, and you look at it and you're like, "That's Hebrew? Doesn't look like Hebrew to me," right? Not what I learned in Hebrew school or in Kita Aleph. Well, it actually is, right? This is ancient Hebrew. And here is the boule on the left. And on the right is how they would write Hebrew letters back in the day in the First Temple period, right? Different from ours. Take a look. I'll just take it's kind of cool thing. There's one little letter here, which is interesting, all right? Shin. Right, see this shin looks like a W. Why is a shin like a W? Well, shin in Hebrew, if you pronounce it with a different vowel, is shen. A shen is a tooth. This is a tooth. All the letters were essentially words, right, that expressed that letter. So the archaeologists, right, went through and they realized that this says Ligmariyahu, missing letter, nun, shafan. And the missing letter here, they assumed, was Ben, son of. Now, why did this archaeologist go wild? Why was he so excited? Don't you know who Gemariah ben Shaphan is? Dramatic pause. Don't be embarrassed. I had no clue who he was before I took the course in the city of David to guide there. No clue. But if you're an archaeologist in the land of Israel and you're digging the biblical period, you know your Tanakh. And lo and behold, Gemariah ben Shaphan is a biblical figure. And he appears in the book of Jeremiah, of Yirmiyahu. Right? So Jeremiah, of course, as we all know, wasn't just, right, a bullfrog. He was a prophet, Yirmiyahu. And he lived in the 7th and 6th century, the end of the 7th century, beginning of the 6th century. And he was a prophet who spoke to a number of different kings, 3 generations of kings, grandfather, father, and son, all the way till the destruction of the city of Yerushalayim. And Yirmiyahu has a very basic message. And his message is, and he speaks it mostly to the kings, also to the people, but mostly to the kings and the ruling power. And he says to them, listen, the city of Yerushalayim is an incredible city. It's a beautiful city. It's a fortified city. It's a city that houses the temple of God, the Beit HaMikdash. It's a holy city. But there's one problem. The people of the city of Yerushalayim are not behaving like the city of Yerushalayim expects them to. If it's a holy city, if it's a city of Kedusha, you have to behave like holy people, Kedoshim to you. What does that mean? Justice, compassion. And he says to them, you are not taking care of the weak. And he specifies the widow, the poor, the orphan. And he also points out one of the very troubling phenomena in that city was that the wealthy people had slaves. Now that in and of itself is not right, is allowed in the Torah. But the Torah says if you have a slave, you can hold them for maximum of 6 years. Comes the 7th year and you must release your slave, just like the 7th day of Shabbat and the 7th year of Shemitah. And the people of Yerushalayim, the aristocracy, the wealthy, the king, it turns out are not releasing their slaves. They're holding on to them. They like the power, they like the comfort, and they have no ear and no heart for those who are weak and needy. And Yirmiyahu says one very simple thing. The city, he says, will stand on condition that it is a city of justice, tzedakah mishpat. And if it doesn't live up to that standard, God will destroy it. And as you can imagine, that's not a message which the king and the ministers want to hear, the wealthy want to hear. And Yirmiyahu first confronts them directly, and when he confronts them directly, they want to kill him, they want his head, and at that point, he flees, but he wants to continue sending his message, and take a look at how he's going to send his message at that point. And I'm going to read here from Yirmiyahu 36. And it came to pass in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Yoshiao, the king of Yehudah, that this word came to Yirmiyahu from the Lord, saying, take for yourself a scroll of a book, and write upon it all the words that I have spoken to you concerning Israel, Judah, and in the nations, since the day that I spoke to you unto this day. Perhaps the house of Judah will hear all the evil that I plan to do them, in order that they should repent each man of his evil way. God says to Yirmiyahu, write a scroll and send him that message. Do tshuva, and if you don't do tshuva, I will destroy the city. Who will receive that message which Yirmiyahu's scribe writes on the scroll? Verse 10, and Baruch read in the book the words of Jeremiah in the house of the Lord, in the chamber of Gemariah, the son of Shaphan, the scribe. The scribe of the king who receives the message of Yirmiyahu is Gemariah ben Shaphan. And now you understand the excitement of that archaeologist who 2,500 years, this message was sent around the year 600, a little before, 604 BCE. 2,600 years later, the archaeologist is holding a seal of that same scribe in his hand. And with that seal, this story comes alive. And it continues, and I'll paraphrase it because we're short of time. You can read it afterwards, right, in the book. The scribe, Gemariah ben Shaphan, the scribe of the king, takes the message to the king. He takes the scroll and he reads Yirmiyahu's prophecy. And the book of Yirmiyahu describes the king sitting in his palace in the winter. It's the month of Kislev. It's freezing cold in Yerushalayim. He's sitting in front of the fire. And he reads 1 verse, 2 verses, 3 verses, 4 verses. And after he reads 4 verses, he takes the scroll and he tears it to pieces and he throws it into the fire and furious. And he says, who is Yirmiyahu to send me this kind of message? The rabbis had an interesting take on this story. And they asked a simple question. What is that book? What is that scroll which Yirmiyahu sent the king Jehoiakim? What was that prophecy which he sent to him? And they come up with a bold answer, a brilliant answer. They said that Yirmiyahu sent him the book of Eicha, the book of Lamentations. Now, the book of Lamentations is a book that describes the destruction of Jerusalem. And it laments the destruction of Jerusalem. We read it every year on Tisha B'Av. And the rabbis are saying that 20 years before that even happened, when Jeremiah was warning that it will happen if you don't repent, he already was writing that book. And then they say, why did Jehoiakim tear the book after the fourth verse? So if you look at this midrash, and again, I'll paraphrase it, right? It appears in the Talmud Moed Katan. When you read the book of Eicha, the first 4 verses speak of the destruction of the city and the people. Eicha yashva badad, the city sits solitary. Bachot tivke balayla, she weeps in the night. Galta Yehuda me'oni, Judah will go into exile. And after each one of those verses, the rabbis say, it was read to the king, and the king answered, and he said, Ha! I am the king. Who are you to tell me that this city will be destroyed? Jerusalem will never be destroyed. This is God's city. The temple is here. And when he reaches the fifth verse says that the enemies of Jerusalem will become the leaders of the city. And at that point, the prophecy wasn't just talking about the people in the city, it was talking about the king. And when the prophecy touched the king, he became furious. He tears it and throws it into the fire. And I want to take you to the next spot, 20 feet away from it on the right, which will take us to the next chapter of this dramatic story. What do they find in this spot? On the left-hand side is how you see it today when you visit the city of David. You come down the stairs from the top, you sit across, and you see this little niche between two walls. Here's a picture of how they found it when it was excavated in the 80s. What did they find in that room? Well, they found two major finds. One, they found a layer of ashes. The entire floor was ashes. The room had been victim to a massive conflagration fire. And they were able to date that fire to the beginning of the 6th century BCE. And in those ashes, they found Babylonian arrowheads. And now came that second aha moment of the archaeologists. When they saw the ashes and they saw the Babylonian arrowhead, this time it wasn't a cry of excitement, but it was a quiet, silent moment of sadness, of remorse, because they realize, the archaeologists, what they're looking at are the signs of the destruction of the city of Jerusalem in the year 586 by the Babylonians. The city had gone up in flames. The Babylonian Empire, that empire which Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, 20 years earlier, had prophesied to the king Jehoiakim and said to him that you must do tshuva, and the city of Jerusalem must be a city of justice, taking care of the poor, the weak, the needy, releasing the slaves, not just glorifying the city and bringing sacrifice to the temple, but it has to be a city of justice. And if it isn't, then God will bring his wrath upon that city through whom? Through the Babylonians. And King Jehoiakim scoffed at him. He took that scroll and he threw it into the fire. The scroll which his scribe, Gamaliel ben Shaphan, whose seal we had uncovered, had handed to him and read to him. And the Babylonian Empire came and it laid waste to the city of Jerusalem. And when you go to the last chapter of the book of Kings, chapter 25, you read, in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, on the 10th of the month, that Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Bevelle, came, he and his entire army, against Jerusalem and encamped against it, and they built works of siege around it. In the 10th day of the month of Tevet, they laid siege. By the way, that's the first fast day in the Jewish calendar year to this day to commemorate the destruction. We still fast to this day, on that day, on the 10th of Tevet. And then 7 verses later, and in the 5th month, the month of Av, on the 7th of the month, Nebuzaradan, chief executioner, his general, servant of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. And he burnt the house of the Lord and the king's palace. He burnt Beit Hashem, Beit HaMikdash, the temple, and he burnt the palace. Those two buildings which we saw in that diagram. And all the houses of Jerusalem and all the houses of the dignitaries he burnt with fire. And the amazing thing about this spot in Ir David is you can go there, you can sit there, you can look at it, and all you will see is stones. You can even walk by it and say, oh, interesting, stones, wow, ancient stones. But if you pause for a moment and you ask the archaeologists, what did you find here? What did you see? They'll show you those two finds, the seals, the boule, and right next to them, the signs of destruction of the city. And suddenly these stones bring alive that biblical story. And that story that we read in Hebrew school, that we study in university or study in yeshiva, and it seems like something ancient. It is ancient, but it seems maybe like mythical, right? And way far back in the past and irrelevant. Suddenly it comes alive. And not only does it come alive as a story physically, but the message of it comes alive. The city of Yerushalayim, and here I want to go back to National Geographic and to the rabbis, is, yes, the center of the world, the eyes of the world. Eyes with which you see justice or injustice. Eyes with which you see what it means to be a holy city, a nation which will be a light unto the nations. And when a city in which you see what happens when, God forbid, that doesn't happen. And I think coming back to Yom Yerushalayim, right, here's a map of the exile of Bevelle. And I want to end with this picture. Right? This is a picture of Slichot in Yerushalayim, the prayers which are said in the month leading up to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And you can see here tens of thousands of Jews coming to pray by the Kotel, by the Temple Mount, right? And hopefully, right, internalizing that message, right, that the city of Yerushalayim is not about great physical monuments, but it's about great moral and ethical messages. Thank you.
Gavriel, thank you so much for just giving us insight into Yerushalayim, clearly not just as a teacher, but as a Yerushalmi that has a personal meaning to you and your family. So thank you. And of course, fly Eagles fly, as we have in common. We do have some time for questions. So I believe in a second, everybody should be able to unmute themselves.
I'll add one more thing, Greg.
Yep.
I just want to encourage everybody here this Friday in one way or another to celebrate Yom Yerushalayim. I know, all right, I'm not naive. I know it's a complicated day. It has a lot of political overtones, especially in this day and age, especially when it comes to those who celebrated from the right wing and nationalists. All that is true. But I think it's also important to keep, right, aside from that, the message of Yerushalayim as the eternal capital of the Jewish people and what it meant for the Jewish people for millennia and what it still means outside of the politics. Right. So okay.
Gavriel, no, thank you. Any questions or thoughts for Gavriel before we do have a few minutes left? If there are any questions, no pressure. You can unmute yourself.
Not a question so much, but I was there for the 50th for Yom Yerushalayim. It was really, really moving and meaningful. And all of us, I mean, we cried, we sang praises of joy. And what it brought to my mind, my father went to Israel many, many times in the 50s and very early 60s. His great sadness was that he never got to the Kotel. He often talked about that. So the unification meant a lot to me personally. And I understand I love going to Jerusalem. In fact, I'm doing a virtual tour. We're going there tonight. So.
Wow. Wow. No, it is amazing. I mean, I haven't been to the Kotel since Corona began, even though they've opened it up. And sometimes I realize how much I take it for granted as a Jerusalemite.
Yeah.
You know, living here, and I have to like put myself in the shoes of people like your father or yourselves who live thousands of miles away, and coming to Jerusalem is a project, right? And here I am walking through the streets of this city every day. Absolutely.
You know, Gabrielle, I'll speak personally. you know, I had the opportunity in college to live in Tel Aviv and in rabbinical school to live in Yerushalayim. And I thought living in Jerusalem would take that, what you were just talking about, away, you know, the sort of, you know, the holy becomes mundane, the everyday. And I will say, personally, in the beginning, it did. And then I think it took some, you know, work, spiritual work, really, to sort of not take for granted, you know, living in Jerusalem, living, you know, on Rehov Lincoln, living near the YMCA, living near, you know, obviously Hebrew Union College, and spending, you know, Shabbat and spending that time in Jerusalem. But I will say, every time you went down from Jerusalem and then came back up, there is something very special. You know, I know, you know, when you did your thing with Lior, and Lior talked about, you know, going, literally making, you know, Aliyah, like to Jerusalem and going down to Jerusalem, and that drive, you know, is something very special. And I, and watching your presentation also felt that same thing, that same sort of emotional connection to the city itself.
There's, I would say there's an intensity in this city, which it's so intense that people from Tel Aviv look at Yerushalayim and they say, how can you live there? Right? Like, how can you live there? It's just, it's insane, right? It's not a normal place. You feel thousands of years of history on your shoulders. You feel the weight of, right? We didn't even go into, right, 3 religions, right? It's just, you have Yirmiyahu, right, screaming in your ears, right? Like, and there's even a syndrome, right, which appears in the what is it? What do you call it? The DSM, the Jerusalem syndrome, right? I mean, there are people who come to this city, and you know, and lose it. Right? Like sensitive people who start hearing voices of pride. Maybe they're not losing it, right? Maybe they're the only ones who are sane. I don't know, right? But yes, it is, you know, and you go to ancient cities in Greece, Rome, and Egypt, and it's about physical monuments, right? And that's what overwhelms you. I remember as a child going to Egypt and seeing temple after temple after temple, and looking and seeing, oh my gosh, how did they build this? And it's so magnificent. And Yerushalayim has none of that, right? It's not about physical might and power, and that's what Yirmiyahu was saying to the king Yehoiakim. Right? Don't think that just because you're king, everything is good. And just because you're sitting in a fortified city, all is good, and just because you have the power, all is good. That's not the point, right? And that's the message of the Torah throughout. That's, you know, this week's Torah portion we just read about the 7th year and the Jubilee and the curses, where God says, if you keep my laws, meaning if you are a just, righteous, compassionate nation, taking care of the poor, that's what this week's portion is about, then I will keep you on the land. And if not, I will send you out, right? That's where the whole land of Israel becomes intense, right? Jews from abroad said, how do you live in Israel? It's a crazy country. That's insane. You know, Israelis are insane. Like, it's so intense, right? But yeah, that's the beauty. That's the power of it.
Gavriel, thank you. Again, for the impassioned teaching, for the personal connection, for the history. You know, it's wonderful to have you join the ranks of our daily classes, and we look forward to learning with you again. You know, before we say goodbye, I want to just make sure that we give you the last word. So thank you again, Gavriel. For the last time, the classroom is yours.
I'll say 2 things. One, thank you for having this opportunity. Thank the JNF. I want to thank my students. I see a whole bunch of them: Jack, Elijah, Andrew, Mark, Noah. So I want to shout out to them. And then I also want to leave you with one last quote, and this is from the Talmud in Brachot, in the Tractate of Brachot. And the rabbis, in 3 words, I think capture what Yerushalayim is, and they say, Yerushalayim zo hanetzach. Yerushalayim, that is eternity. You want to understand what eternal truth, what beyond time, above time, before time is, come to Yerushalayim.
Shkoch. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Gavriel. And we'll see you all tomorrow.
Bye.
I said you wish you could be here.